Major General Jim Molan is a retired Army officer, a co-author of Australia's border control policies under the Abbott government. He was the Prime Ministerial Envoy for Operation Sovereign Borders under Prime Minister Abbott, a distinguished Australian, and he joins us tonight. Jim Molan, good evening and thank you for your time.
Thanks, Alan. Thank you.
What do we do?
Well, I look back on our experience of Operation Sovereign Borders, Alan, and I say to myself that what made that work primarily was the resolve of the leadership. And when we look at the way Brussels has handled everything since I've been watching it post the Paris attacks, we can see an extraordinary comparison between what we have done in Australia in relation to legislation, in relation to border control, in relation to an inclusive society, and the way that Brussels has handled what they've done. We've seen extraordinary failures in relation to individuals warning the Belgians that people who are coming in are in fact jihadis. They were warned specifically about their airports and they were warned about their nuclear facilities. I think the one thing that drives success in this area is leadership. And if the EU is going to take away from countries their responsibility for their own security and their border control, but not replace it with central responsibility, Europe's got a problem.
But Turkey warned Belgium about these two brothers, and those warnings were ignored.
They did, and Interpol warned them about individuals, and the US warned them about individuals. The Israelis came in and did an assessment of Brussels Airport and warned it that it had gross failures of security. And I think it's the mark of a mature nation, at least in the security area, where you don't have to wait for a disaster to take security measures. I think that's what marks a different country, and we're not seeing that at the moment in Brussels or in Europe.
Absolutely. I remember you saying, because I spoke to you after Paris, and that's precisely what you said. The Paris disaster is a consequence of failed intelligence and failed security. How many failures has Europe allowed?
It shouldn't be one, but I guess being full of human beings, it's going to make error after error after error. I became involved in the discussion on uncontrolled migration into Europe about 6 months ago, and what I stumbled on then was that classic view of unthinking custom and practice. This is what we do around here, and we've always done it this way. There was no central direction, there was no resolve, and there was no realisation of consequences. And we've seen Europe over a long period of time now, probably 15 years, very much prepared to let the United States and countries such as the UK and Australia carry the burden in the Middle East, and not provide as much assistance as it could do, let the US do all the hard work. And there are consequences of inaction. People have often said to me, why are we in the Middle East? We're Australia, we're a long way away. There are always consequences of inaction, just as there are consequences of action.
Just on this business of carrying the burden, Angela Merkel's supposed to be a really tough leader and virtually the political leader of Europe. No one has yet explained why all these refugees from Muslim countries, and we're talking about Syria, should be allowed to migrate to Europe, presumably for the welfare state and its wealth, when you get the Muslim Brotherhood, their brothers and sisters in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and Oman and even Indonesia, take none of them. That doesn't make sense to many Europeans.
No, and it certainly doesn't make sense to me, and the lack of involvement by many of the Arab states. Now, they are involved in places like Yemen, and Iran is involved in Syria, and it's involved in Iraq. It really is a problem, and I think the fact we went through a similar situation in relation to Indonesia and Australia during sovereign borders, and we managed that well. In the end, we were on the same side.
But to interrupt you there, Jim, you used a very important image at that time. You said you were going to take the sugar off the table, and the sugar was the capacity to come into this wonderful country of Australia, come in via the back door and enjoy its benefits. Now, surely one of the central problems of Europe is they continue to leave the sugar on the table.
That's exactly right. Absolutely correct. And the President of Indonesia used that term first. And what it comes back to, and what I discovered as the Prime Minister's Special Envoy, was that if each nation in our region just looks after its own borders, let's not change the world, just look after your own borders, you solve your own problems and you solve your neighbours' problems. I wrote in Il Globo, I wrote in the Times, I spoke on Deutsche Welle, and I found that throughout Europe, they could learn nothing from us, Alan, because they had not arrived at a stage in their own thinking whereby they would control their borders. So they said, no, we're not going to control our borders, so we can't learn anything from the Australians. Well, now they realise the consequences of not controlling their borders, and now they might look at us and realise the success that we had.
But can you put the scrambled eggs back in the egg? I mean, you've got this Schengen, S-C-H-E-N-G, an area named after a town in Germany where the agreement was reached, where you've got 26 European countries that have abolished passports of any kind, any type of border control, so Europe is a common border. Surely to God, that's a recipe for failure.
I think it is, and I think that it won't be long for this world. The other aspect is that there is an assessment process in most of these countries whereby you do assess the people who are coming into the countries as to whether they should receive a refugee status. Now, if you take 1 million and something people into Germany, that process is going to be either very slow or totally corrupted by the fact there's too many people and they will have access to a legal system which is not designed to do it. One of the Scandinavian countries recently said they're going to return 50,000 people to Syria. How they will do this will be very interesting. But one thing that I always say is that there seems to be a confusion in Europe that the only way to show humanity to these poor people that are trapped on the Syrian-Turkey border is to bring them into Europe. That's not true at all. You can show humanity in a number of other ways. But there seems to be that thought, particularly in Germany, possibly it comes from its refugee, its asylum background, that the only way to do it is to open everything up and let people come in. Yeah. And David Kilcullen told us over the weekend that one of the Paris bombers, one of the people, the jihadis who was captured after the Paris bombers, was one of 90 people, trained jihadis who entered Europe at the same time through the European crisis. So if that's not a grounds for concern.
Well, I mean, and the bloke was involved in the Paris bombing. He then came back to Brussels, undetected, lived in the suburb of Molenbeek for months and months and months, and by accident was unearthed. I mean, when you say about humanity, why wouldn't someone like Merkel or Hollande pick up the phone to Saudi Arabia or Oman or Kuwait or Indonesia? These are rich countries, and say, now listen, why don't you take some of your own brothers instead of allowing them to flee towards the infidels?
Well, I suspect that there would be a view that it wouldn't work. I don't say they shouldn't do it, but there are other ways they could do it. By bringing people into a country, you invariably pay a lot more. So you might be able to support 1 million people by bringing them into Germany, but you may be able to use that same amount of money and support 10 million people in refugee camps in Jordan and Turkey.
Absolutely. Come closer to home, because people are now asking, well, 12,000 we've agreed to take of these people, and they're thinking of Brussels, they're thinking of Paris, they're thinking of Ankara, they're thinking, of course, Northern Africa. And the FBI in America said, deliberately really, basically standing up to Obama, if there's a problem, basically I'm paraphrasing, if there's a problem in this country, don't blame us. We don't believe we have the data to be able to make appropriate security checks on these people. Do we have the appropriate data to be able to determine, when we let these 12,000 people into Australia, that they are not likely to be a terrorist risk, or they're not likely to radicalise young Australians when they arrive?
Yes. This is an enormous question, Alan, and I'm comforted by the fact that Peter Dutton told us last week that less than 100 have come into this country so far of the 12,000 who are coming in over 5 years. Now, that would indicate, as the previous Prime Minister did say when this decision was made, that we will vet them, that would indicate, at least to me, that whatever they're doing very thoroughly. So, and he also reassured us that they would be, the majority of the 12,000 would be people who had the most need. Now, that just happens to be families, not young adult males, but families of Christians who will never be able to go back and live where they were because of Islam extremists who had persecuted them out of the country.
Should there be
so I don't know the exact answer.
Should there be Muslims amongst these people? I mean, the rank and file Australians are saying we've had enough of this. We just can't trust the problem. There are plenty of Christians who are being persecuted in the Middle East. If we've got 12,000 spots, they say, give them to Christians.
Yes, and I've heard that said. I think there inevitably will be Muslims amongst them. The way that the statement was made by the Immigration Minister indicated to me that there probably would be Muslims amongst them, but they will still have gone through the same vetting process that the others have gone through. Now, that's nothing will be perfect, and I think that's the point you're getting to. I think this is a risk we're going to have to take now. If it goes bad, it could have bad consequences for us, but the number of less than 100 would indicate to me they're doing it very, very seriously.
Canberra today don't appear to be prepared to say that we have got pockets in our suburbs, in Sydney and other places, where young people are being radicalised. Do you believe this is going on? And why aren't we prepared to say it as it is? I mean, Tony Blair and Barack Obama in the last 72 hours have both called the issue for what it is, Islamist extremism. And even leaders in the Muslim community have made the similar point. We can't get those two words out of our leaders in Canberra.
Well, I think it's quite obvious that what we're facing in the world is Islamic extremism. Some people call it Islamism to really confuse us all. What I think the importance of a term like that, and if I had to define it, I define it in the following way. I define it as being a perverted strain of politically motivated Islamic ideology. So it's not a religion, it's ideology based on a perverted form of Islam. I can say that, Ellen, because it assists me to differentiate between the people who are doing this to us all across the world, and 38,000 people were killed by terrorism the year before last. I can say this because I had 5 years living in the largest Muslim country in the world, Indonesia, which stands in absolute stark contradiction to everything that Islamist extremists stand for. So I can differentiate between the two, and it's very important that we do. David Irvin, our last chief of ASIO, said that our greatest defence is our Muslim community, and I think we should be very, very careful. We can attack Islamic extremism, but we must respect our Muslim community, but we must have expectations of our Muslim community.
To be fair to that,
I think that's what's important.
Yeah, to be fair to that community, almost immediately after Brussels, the Islamic High Council of Australia, Darul Fatwa, issued a statement which said in part, Darul Fatwa Australia make clear to all governments in nations around the world, and this is the point you've been making, that there's a difference between faithful Muslims and these extremist terrorists. It also makes clear there is no relation and justification for this evil phenomenon in Islam. So they've made that clear themselves as well. Therefore, to you, Major General, how do you deal with this evil phenomenon? What should we be doing around the world? Do we need feet on the ground? Is this a war, as the Pope said?
I think there's a couple of things that we need to do, Alan. The first thing, we need to have confidence that we can win this. And I talk about winning this in the sense that we can defeat, as we have defeated 12 times since 1979, we can defeat this particular form of Islamic extremism. Secondly, I think we should expect that it will take some considerable time, and once we defeat this, there will be a new form of it. This has been the way over history for a long, long time. I think we should have confidence that the strategy that the Americans are leading us with, and we're strategy takers rather than makers, the strategy that the Americans are leading us with in the Middle East to attack this at its source is starting to work because they're starting to resource it. Now, the Islamic State are masters of action as propaganda. And you go back to the anarchists and you see this beautiful line throughout history of action as propaganda. Everything they're doing is aimed at propaganda that's going straight into the kids' living room. And who are the people who can touch these kids more than anyone else? Their parents. Their parents. In so much, we expect parents to play a pivotal role in the lives of our children. From what I can see, parents should be playing a pivotal role in what impressionable young people are receiving in their dark bedrooms through their computers.
Yeah. Tony Abbott said last November, when he was no longer Prime Minister, no one can now avoid the choice between bad and worse, especially when inaction is itself a choice, especially in the wake of Paris and Sinai, and we can add to that now Ankara and Brussels. Tony Abbott said it's becoming clearer that an understandable reluctance to accept military casualties abroad could easily lead to more civilian casualties at home. What do you think of that comment?
I think that is a very logical comment, and I would endorse that comment. And I think that the Americans under President Obama have come to that conclusion.
Yes.
I think that and it's taken them a long, long time to come to that conclusion. There's one aspect that I am slightly dissatisfied with the American strategy over in the Middle East, and that is that it's taking a long, long time to achieve the effect. It's going in the right direction, but every time you accept that in order to avoid the casualties that the last PM was talking about, that you extend the time out. You don't do things, therefore the battles go out. You risk strategic surprise. And again, I have listed for my own edification 12 instances of strategic surprise that we have faced, which disrupts our strategy. Things like the Syrian civil war, like the Arab Spring, like the Turks bombing the PKK, like the involvement of Iran in Iraq or the Russians in Syria. If you don't do things fast with some degree of speed, you risk strategic surprise. What's the real strategic surprise that terrifies me? It's nuclear terrorism. Yeah. So it's lovely to sit back and say we have unlimited time to do these things, but we've seen Paris, we've seen Brussels, we've seen Lahore, and maybe even the Pakistanis will go for the Taliban, and they're doing an awful lot. Yeah. But maybe that they will be prompted into action.
Tony Abbott volunteered what he thought was a solution. He talked about a coalition with Sunni states. He mentioned Egypt, Jordan, the United States, Britain, France and so on, and that we should all prepare to contribute more to a military campaign. I guess that's a debate for another day. We are running out of time, but I want to ask you one question, and I say it to our viewers. You just heard a remarkable exposition by this man in civilian life, Jim Molan, Major General Jim Molan. A little question left of field. You offered yourself for the Liberal Party for Senate pre-selection in New South Wales. The Senate pre-selection has recently taken place. Am I right in saying that they stuck you on an unwinnable position on the ticket?
Alan, I was third on the ticket.
Unwinnable.
And perhaps you're right, we'll see on that. I do have some concerns over this, but I will take them back through the party. I believe in doing things properly and the rule of law, and I will take my concerns back through the party.
Let me just tell our viewers the reason Jim Molan has answered the question like that. If you open your mouth in the Liberal Party, and he's a member of the Liberal Party, and say anything detrimental to it, you will be suspended. Witness Ross Cameron on this television station, and the great man Charlie Lynn. Jim Nolan, great to talk to you. We wish you well. I wish there were people like you in public office. I wish the Liberal Party had the foresight to put you at the top of the ticket, not at the unwinnable number 3. But keep advocating as you are. Thank you for your time. We're very grateful for the contribution you've made to our country in action and in ideas.
Thanks, Alan. Thank you very much.
Major General Jim Molan.